So my name is Susie Mcclannahan. I'm the Fair Housing Director at the Equal Rights Center. I'm going to be talking a bit more about affirmatively furthering fair housing, or some folks may know of it as AFFH, and the Washington Regional Fair Housing Plan that was passed in 2023. So, as a bit of background, the Equal Rights Center is a fair housing organization based in Washington, D.C. We serve the entire state of Maryland, the District of Columbia, Northern Virginia, kind of down to Fredericksburg, and then all the way out to Jefferson County, West Virginia. And we provide direct assistance to individuals who are experiencing housing discrimination, as well as conducting testing and doing systemic investigations throughout the region. I'm going to go a couple slides ahead. Next one. Next. Okay. So, just a bit of background. You may have heard about affirmatively furthering fair housing in the news, and that's because it keeps falling back and forth about what's going on. But the basic foundation is that when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, there was a sentence or two that said that in addition to making it illegal to discriminate based on these identities, and by doing these, sorry, I'm too loud?
Yes.
Let me back up, sorry.
That's me.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not better?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're good.
Great. Okay. So not only are there prohibited or protected identities upon which it's illegal to discriminate, specific actions that it's illegal to do, they also have this sentence in there saying that federal agencies and jurisdictions that receive federal funds must work to affirmatively further fair housing. And for about half a century, that sentence kind of just stayed in the law and nobody paid any attention to it. But starting in 2015, slide. Next slide, sorry. Okay. So it started essentially that the federal agencies or any local government that receives federal funds or a local government agency is responsible for affirmatively furthering fair housing if they receive those funds. So Arlington County, for instance, makes a commitment when it gets funding from the federal government, from HUD, that it will affirmatively further fair housing if it accepts that money. Next slide. Now, what happened is in 2015, the Obama administration put in new regulations to actually strengthen what this meant. Because again, essentially until then, no one was doing anything about this. And so it passed initially stating that agencies receiving federal funding needed to make sure that they were actually meaningfully affirmatively furthering fair housing, and they needed to outline what steps they were doing as opposed to just saying that this was something they were doing. HUD then, and the Trump administration, suspended the rule in 2018, and then they submitted a new proposed rule in 2020. Then the Biden administration came in, scrapped that, and proposed a new rule in 2021. Was anyone at the Fair Housing Conference last year? Okay, there was a great speaker, Helen Hardiman, who gave a beautiful presentation about the new proposed rule under the Biden administration that was going to go even further in community engagement in order to improve the current rule that had been passed by the Obama administration. They sat on the rule too long, and ultimately the proposed rule never got finalized, even though it was supposedly written and done. They were worried it was going to influence the election. They didn't actually put in the final rule, and so then at the very last minute in January, they actually just removed the proposed rule. Then the Trump administration came in, and they proposed a new rule in March. So next slide. So in the prior affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, essentially they needed to strive to address historic patterns of racial segregation, preserve integrated housing that already exists, and otherwise take meaningful steps to further the Fair Housing Act's purpose beyond merely refraining from taking discriminatory actions. So lots of times when we talk about civil rights laws, they're essentially about stopping the discriminatory behavior that was happening up until this point. The problem is that it doesn't actually undo all the harm that occurred up until before the law was passed, and so this was actually an extremely progressive provision that said not only do we recognize that we should stop discriminating moving forward, but all this discrimination up until now has had significant, long-lasting harms to our communities, and We need to find ways to undo that harm. We can't simply say, well, we're gonna stop now, and any discrimination that happened up until 1968 was fine, but we'll not do that anymore. It was like, how did we get here, and how can we undo the legacy of that discrimination? Next slide. Unfortunately, with the March 2025, it's an interim final rule, meaning essentially it already goes into effect, but they did take comments about it until yesterday. And what it says is that we know that you were putting plans together in order to identify barriers, and that's what local jurisdictions were frequently using to identify what the issues were and how they were going to address them, is they would do what's called an analysis of pediment or regional fair housing plan, and they would look at the research. They would release reports that were hundreds of pages long and say, based on this research, this is what the changes we should make. And so actually some of the quotes that you all read in the pages we handed out were from the local DC region analysis of impediments. So the new rule says we don't need you to do reports anymore. You don't actually have to look into what the barriers are. You don't need to research that. You can simply self-certify. We'll take you at your word that you are doing this work. So we don't actually need you to tell us why you're doing it, what you're doing. Just tell us you're definitely doing it, and we'll say, great, we believe you. It also says, instead of taking meaningful action to change historic patterns of segregation and harm that occurred to communities as a result of discrimination, it says that you can do any action that is rationally related to promoting fair housing, and that is sufficient to meet this requirement. So as long as you do anything potentially related to fair housing as a local government, you are good to go. You did it. You affirmatively furthered fair housing. So this isn't really great news, because it means that the rule is pretty much at this floor, right? There's very little oversight or enforcement. There's no real research that they have to do to understand the barriers, and you don't actually have to do all that much to actually reach that threshold. That being said, the good news is that essentially the Washington region already did their plan, and they finished it in 2023, and the plan goes to 2028. Now they could have chosen to opt out and say, you know what, the Trump administration said we don't have to do this anymore, we're not going to do that, but that has not been the case, and so this is actually a really great opportunity to ask local governments to step up and continue to do this to meet their burden without necessarily having to have the federal government, sign off on it. So what the federal government said is the floor, but you can essentially rise above that and continue to do more work than that. You don't have to only do that. So next slide. Okay, so the Regional Fair Housing Plan was written by Alexandria, Arlington County, the City of Gaithersburg, DC, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, Montgomery County, technically not Prince George's County, they did their own. That was my bad putting this on that slide. Please disregard. They provided data to the plan, but they did not do this part of the plan together. This was actually pretty revolutionary for the DC area. Historically, every region's done their own plan, so DC did their own, Fairfax County did their own, and everyone did their own plans. But we know that the barriers do not stop at city or county limits, right? It's not like the moment you drive out of Arlington County near Fairfax County or Alexandria, there's a completely new housing scene. We have no idea what's going on there. So this was really great that they actually all sat and got together and said, what are the barriers across the region? How are they interplaying with each other, and what can we do about them? Okay. So the plan looked at barriers to access to opportunity in a variety of areas: education, employment, housing, transportation. And this is also extremely good to note because, again, a lot of times when we talk about a particular topic, we aren't talking about them together. So we might be talking about what's going on with housing, what's going on with education, what's going on with employment, transportation all separately, but they're not talking together about what do our neighborhoods look like? How can people get between neighborhoods for jobs? What transportation is available to them if they're living in certain parts of Arlington County? How accessible are the various neighborhoods for people with disabilities? So the report is extremely comprehensive and hundreds and hundreds of pages. I will admit, this is my day job and I have not read the whole report. just to be frank. Like, it is extremely dense. But it also provides a wealth of information about how we can address issues both in like the Arlington County specifically, but also in the region as a whole. So where Arlington County falls in that. And so many of you discussed some of these topics today during lunch. Does that sound right? We just did it, great. You all looked at me like bright eyes and I was like, this happened just 15 minutes ago. Great, okay. So who discussed the racial homeownership gap? Anyone? Can you share a bit about some of the barriers that you all identified? No pressure. But I didn't get to go off the spot.
Well, what did we say? We got off onto stories and real life experiences. So some of the reasons for the gap were not wide range opportunity for affordable housing throughout the county. That for some people, affordable housing is limited to a small portion of the county, which may not work for them, either for jobs or for schooling or for what have you. So that narrow range of narrow mass of affordable housing in smaller areas makes it inequitable.
You also say finances and passing down land, generational wealth. What else did we say?
We talked a lot.
Yeah, more some stories. So.
Folks, if you talked about inclusionary zoning, anyone do inclusionary zoning missing middle? What were some of the housing challenges that we're facing without stronger inclusionary zoning practices that you all identified?
Well, what we talked about is how Arlington is getting rid of housing, and it's being done on different levels. Arlington is allowing apartments to be built, and then after the apartments are built, they then go back to the county and ask to be turned into hotels or the equivalent of short-term overnight rentals, and it's getting county approval. The other thing is that Airbnb has many contracts with the apartment complexes in Arlington, and what that does is it takes housing units away from what would be considered the people who are the missing middle purchasers. So missing middle housing is being removed by the county. The county needs to possibly change their laws because they allow rental complexes to Airbnb and short-term rental, and most of the other places only allow homeowners to do that. We have a number of out of Arlington, out of state, and international people who are renting units in Arlington specifically for the purpose of overnight Airbnbs.
Okay.
So, we're getting rid of our housing stock.
Okay, so there's already some overlap we're seeing, right? There's not enough housing and it's not being used by the folks who need it. Who talked about housing affordability?
What to say?
You got 30 seconds.
Not enough supply. Perry is not a place to live, right? We're victims of our own success. Underpaid people cannot compete in the market. And while Arlington has subsidized, we have over 12,000 affordable units that are reserved at those levels. It's a drop in the bucket. We need triple that. And so the competition is there, and people at the lower income of the scale cannot compete with folks making more money.
Anyone else want to share what they talked about? Front table? Have you all gone yet?
We ended up talking about transportation and how wonderful it is that buses are free in Alexandria, and that, I think you were mentioning Richmond that adopted a pilot, but then now they can't fund it. But that really makes housing more accessible to people who can't afford cars. And I talked about the American Legion building in Arlington, that if it had been one more parking level, it wouldn't have been feasible to build it, which is now it's an affordable housing place for veterans. And it all is connected, it's all interconnected, but we need to make affordable housing available near transit and make it easy for people to get around. And we're also talking about what was going on with Metro, and that in a way it's a good thing that people are being forced to go back to work physically. At least it's good for Metro, but it may not be good for their personal lives or their personal balance. But anyway, it's all sort of interconnected with affordable housing too. And we also talked about the Netherlands and how everybody rides a bike, and the whole country is built on transportation that is provided by bike. It's good for the environment. They treat it very seriously. They protect their bike riders, and that's another thing we talked about. Is it safe to ride a bike? And we were talking about the barriers that it's sometimes difficult to negotiate. You could talk about that. But anyway, that's the kind of thing we talk about.
Okay, so even though we all had different topics, we're seeing a lot of overlap, right? Related to housing supply, affordability, a lack of options. So with the research that the various local governments did, if you want to go to the next slide, these were the goals that they came up with based on the problems they identified. 1, increase affordable housing, particularly in areas that have historically lacked such housing. 2, reform zoning and land use policies to increase the supply and geographic distribution of affordable housing. 3, there's only 7 goals, and we're already on 3 about affordable housing, so you can sense the theme. Preserve affordable housing and prevent displacement with a goal of no net loss of existing affordable rental units. 4, increase homeownership and reduce inequities and discriminatory practices that prevent homeownership. 5, protect the housing rights of individuals with protected characteristics. 6, increase community integration and reduce housing barriers for people with disabilities. And 7, expand access and affordability of public transportation for protected classes. So, taking a minute to look at these goals, and based on the conversations you had and the report backs we just had as a group, do you have any initial thoughts about these goals? Do you think that they're reflective of the totality of changes that we need to make? Are there goals you think are missing, or goals you're like, why was this included? Any initial kind of reflections? I was asking the audience their thoughts on what do we feel when we look at these? Are we like, yes, this is really exciting, or like, there are 7 other things I have ideas on. Why didn't they make the list? What are we feeling?
Feeling like they're pretty good. And
Good?
if we could do those, we'd really be in business.
All right. Is that where most people are feeling by show of hands? Like, great, seems pretty good.
My question is how?
Great question. Love that. We're heading towards that part. Okay. So we talked about barriers in our groups. I'm curious what some of the solutions, the how, were that you all came up with, and if you see them falling kind of within this list of goals. So every table, if you want to just take like a minute to kind of share what were some of the changes that you wanted to see, whether it was like ways to address the racial homeownership gap, way to make housing more affordable, what those are, and whether you see that those would fall under kind of these larger goals. Don't all speak at once, everyone.
Well, we were the affordable housing table, and the zoning issue came up. When we were talking about it being at the state level, and why isn't Arlington doing something about it? Well, they can't because it's the state level. Allowing builders to put these mega homes that aren't affordable homes, they're just gigantic. They are worse than townhouses as far as proximity to each other, but the county has to allow that to happen because it's within the zoning right, so, you know, I wanna know, how can we change the state zoning laws to get that to stop?
Okay.
And who tackles that?
Zoning, at the state level? I mean, one, I would talk to Home of Virginia, because they're doing a lot of the state level advocacy. But, not to put Alice on the spot, but you might also have some ideas. Or great.
I was just gonna say, having served on the county board and now the state senate, I understand both sides of that argument. The county actually has a fair amount of flexibility because in the state constitution, all of the land use is designated to the county. But if we were to substantially change a homeowner's rights, that would be a problem. And the county would be liable to a lawsuit, which is why they would want the protection of a state, a state permissive authority. It would be very challenging, even under democratic trifecta. It's folks buy their single-family homes, they keep them for appreciation, they sell it so they'll have resources to take care of themselves in their later years, and they don't want that infringed upon. So when I was on the county board, whenever we talked about narrowing the building envelope for a single-family home, it was, oh no, don't do that, you're affecting my appreciation.
Yeah.
So I just wanted you to know it's a very complex issue.
Well,
I'm not sure I added to the conversation, but.
Yeah, no, I get that, but my concern was allowing developers to take a piece of property and put 40 mega houses, as opposed to changing the zoning requirements and only allowing 20. How can we address that?
well, I think Arlington County did partially try to address zoning via missing middle, where it was going to increase the number of units that you could place.
Right.
And that unfortunately was challenged by NIMBYism. Yeah, right? And that is very frustrating.
Yes.
So that is currently playing out through the courts, and to be honest, I think many local counties are watching that court case very carefully, probably Alexandria, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, about how that plays out, because that was a multi-year process to make a very modest change, broadly speaking, and now it has been completely halted, essentially. So that is, in this table talked about inclusionary zoning, so curious to hear what you all have for goals.
But,
Solutions.
well, if you're going to talk about the missing middle, as a Latina, I think that the Latino community was used. They were told in their written documents that this was going to be affordable housing. They were given information, which was in one sheet, which was in Spanish, which said, scan this code and you'll learn more. And when you scan the code, the stuff was all in English, so it was not understandable. When everything a year later comes out, it was never meant for Latino families. Latino families want homes. They don't want a 1-unit or a 2-unit apartment. They want a place where they can have multi-generational. And so what was actually going to happen is that housing stock, which could be multi-generational, was going to be destroyed in favor of the new people coming into Arlington, like the Amazon employees, who were single people who wanted a 1-unit apartment. So, when you say, this was all done multi-year and kind of give the impression it was with the approval of local residents, I can tell you no. As far as affordable housing advocates and people who want affordable housing, it was to their detriment. And I think, there was a comment about every neighborhood has a neighborhood association, and there's a county-wide neighborhood association of all of the different neighborhoods. And they were 100% against it, and they weren't listened to. So, that you say it's 7 people that brought this against the county, behind those 7 people who were brave enough to actually put their names and go forward were thousands of people who support them. So I want affordable housing for everyone. And I think there's laws that we can do in Arlington, especially with the accessible dwelling units. We could almost possibly double the number, well, we could definitely double the number of that if we would allow people to actually turn their garages into something that someone else would actually want to rent and made it easier. I mean, there's some really low-level policies that could be changed in Arlington to increase housing stock dramatically within a year, 18 months. So.
See Alice's hand up. So.
So I worked on this topic, daily for 2 or 3 years, so we could talk for a long time, and I will not make this into controversy because we can agree to disagree. But I do disagree with most of what you said. I gave presentations in Spanish myself to Latinos, and that was not at all the message that we told them. We let them know that this might be mostly home ownership at the beginning, and that they themselves, this generation, does not make enough money to own anything in Arlington, even something small. But if we can get these little units spread across our county, their children could get a good job as a bilingual, college-educated person, and indeed might be able to come back and live in Arlington like my kids are not going to be able to. So to me, it was opportunity. It was also reintegration of neighborhoods. We are extremely segregated here, okay? Like 95% of the kids who go to Nottingham, Jamestown are white children. 95% of the children who go to Carbon Springs are children of color, and they're 5 miles apart. So we have a lot of work to do, and we can't do that unless we integrate, okay, and reintegrate. And in terms of multi-generational, missing middle is the perfect thing for multi-generational, because you could build on or rebuild, make a triplex. Grandparents are, entry level on bottom, other generations above. It's an opportunity. We don't have that kind of housing here. So sort of reintroduced a type of housing that was outlawed for racial discrimination reasons a century ago. So it's complicated. I totally understand. It's controversial. I get it. But I will say that this, if it had gone through and stayed, the very watered down version that actually got passed would have allowed a maximum of 58 units across this entire county. We have over 100,000 individual housing units of every kind. So look at the drop in the bucket would have been. And yet it's a C-star. Every C-star that gets back in the ocean gets an opportunity it didn't have on the beach. And if we could start to do that and show people it's not the end of the world, wow, we could have some progress. Finally, you mentioned about accessory dwellings. This is an exact same process. Those were passed almost 15 years ago. The regulations were so tight. In 15 years, I think we got 20 units total that were legally, accessory dwellings. We went back and loosened up and reconsidered the policy, and that brought some more that were only attached to the home. And then 2 years later, we went back again, and the county board now allows detached. So you mentioned garages. It is legal to make your garage into a rental unit now. There's standards. Obviously, it has to be safe, it has to be code and all that, but that is doable. And my hope is that eventually those accessory dwellings could be ownership opportunities. Right now, you have to either live in the main or the accessory unit to rent out the other one. So for some people, that's problematic. But imagine an older woman, myself, my husband, we could live in our revamped garage, and rent out the main house, and that's how you age in community, by getting creative on that plot of land. So happy to talk to you about it later, but I just couldn't not.
I'll make allowance for don't get home.
Can I ask, and this would be really helpful, this builds on what Senator Cole was talking about. I always thought that zoning was something that the state had given authority to the localities. What are the tangible things that we could do at the state level, specifics, that we could introduce to loosen that up? That what powers, like we talk about accessory dwelling units, you have that authority. We talk about missing middle, you have that authority. you have a lot of authority to zone. What can you not do that is prohibited by the state? Because I think Senator Kroll and I would be interested in changing that.
I'll
That's
just do
specific.
the contract for you. Or, yeah, contract.
We're running low on time.
Great. Okay, I think that what can we do at the state level is such a large question, and probably everyone here has a slightly different answer. So I do want to make clear, my understanding, Arlington County has already tried to loosen its zoning, right? It was not something that the state had to intervene on, but it's that it has been fought now in court, and that's why it's paused. So zoning, I don't think is particularly a state level issue. There are a number of state level issues we actually talked about earlier, just before lunch, unfortunately. But I think that right now, I think some of the conversations from earlier were related to both protections for tenants, and then also related to addressing barriers to the homeownership gap, like appraisal bias. And part of that was honestly bills were passed, but then they were vetoed by Governor Youngkin. So just to be clear on that.
Not to speak out of turn, but with a different governor, we might have a shot at getting more tenant protections.
Let's be ready.
Yeah, we're playing a shot at getting more tenant protections in place, and as my colleague just said, we have bills that have laid out a pathway forward. So that
We're eager to do
would be
it.
helpful, yeah.
Just tell us
The
what.
ones that were rejected would be ready to go at
Okay. So I love the enthusiasm, even more than I could hope for. I do want to make sure that we keep on schedule. And one of the things that I'm sensing a lot of urgency and eagerness around is solutions. And so this was to provide actually the background. Helen's going to speak next, and he's going to be talking about specifically what is Arlington County doing. To some degree, how does it fit within this 5-year plan, and what are potential opportunities for further progress on fair housing. So I'm going to turn it over to Helen. And after Helen speaks, if we have time, we'll do more questions and answer then. We just want to value everyone's time. So Helen's going to take it away now.